Bonjour à tous, bonjour. Je suis très heureux de vous accueillir pour cette interview très spéciale où j'ai l'immense plaisir de recevoir Andreas Malm. Alors avant qu'il intervienne, je vais le présenter très rapidement. C'est un maître de conférence en géographie humaine, mais il est surtout connu pour son militantisme. Il est classé à l'extrême gauche et c'est certainement l'une des figures les plus connues euh, autour de la lutte contre la catastrophe climatique. Mais il se penche aussi sur d'autres sujets. On va le voir, il y a la question de l'anti-impérialisme et ici, plus précisément, la question de la Palestine. Donc, on va explorer ce sujet avec Andreas Malm. On va voir quels sont les rapports qu'on peut faire entre la lutte contre la catastrophe climatique et la Palestine. Et on va parler plus en profondeur aussi de la lutte pour la Palestine. Je vais aussi parler des livres dont il a écrit. Il en a écrit énormément, mais là, on va se pencher sur ceux écrits en français. L'avantage, c'est qu'ils sont tous édités chez La Fabrique. Il y a tout d'abord l'Anthropocène contre l'histoire, le réchauffement climatique à l'ère du capital en 2017. Comment saboter une pipeline qui a été édité en 2020. La chauve-souris et le capital, stratégie pour l'urgence chronique en 2020 aussi. On a Avis de tempête, nature et culture dans un monde qui se réchauffe en 2023. Il a aussi coordonné le livre écrit par le Zetkin Collective, Fascisme fossile, l'extrême droite, l'énergie et le climat. Et enfin, le dernier qui vient de sortir, encore à la fabrique, pour la Palestine comme pour la Terre, les ravages de l'impérialisme fossile. Bonjour Andreas Malm.
Bonjour, I'm very honored to be here.
Alors, je suis vraiment très très content de vous accueillir. La première question que je voudrais vous poser, c'est comment ça se fait que vous avez écrit un livre sur la Palestine? Parce que pour certaines personnes, les gens vont se dire, mais c'est pas son sujet, lui il parle de climat, donc ça ne devrait pas l'intéresser. Pourquoi vous avez voulu écrire sur la Palestine?
Well, personally, I did Palestine solidarity work for years before I cared about the climate.
Mm.
My first books in Swedish were about Palestine.
D'accord.
The very first that would be translated into Bulldozers Against the People was based on my experiences in Palestine in the spring of 2002. Most of the West Bank, but Gaza as well. And I was active as an organizer in the International Solidarity Movement during the Second Intifada. So, for me, in my own biography and trajectory, Palestine came before the climate. Then I kind of shifted my focus in my professional life towards climate in 2005 or something like that. But I've always, of course, been very committed to the Palestinian cause, although I haven't been in the country since 2004 for various reasons. I doubt that I will be allowed entry as long as this entity is in place. I have had, I mean, if we're going to take it on a personal level, I've had feelings of guilt about kind of leaving Palestine in my work. When the genocide started, I obviously felt that I need to intervene in some way, apart from obviously attending all the demonstrations that I could and things like that, and contribute something with what I can do, which is speaking or writing. I gave a lecture at Stockholm University and in late 23, and then I was invited to give a lecture at the American University of Beirut, and for that invitation I prepared a manuscript that then became this book.
Ok. Je sais pas si vous le savez, mais alors je pense que vous avez eu des retours des camarades français, mais ici c'est très très difficile d'afficher un soutien pour la Palestine, même d'aller dans une forme de radicalité, de pas tergiverser sur le soutien envers la Palestine. Il y a des perquisitions, il y a des gens qui sont intimidés. Je sais que vous voyagez un peu partout. Est-ce que pour vous, est-ce que déjà vous êtes au courant de ça, de cette intimidation sur la lutte pour la Palestine en France? Est-ce que pour vous, ça se retrouve aussi dans d'autres pays où il y a une spécificité en France? Et comment vous expliquez que ce soit aussi difficile de l'aborder?
No, it's not a French phenomenon exclusively. The intensifying repression against the Palestine Solidarity Movement is happening all over the global north. It's very similar, by the way, to the intensifying repression against the climate activism. but it looks different in different countries. And France might be bad, but it's nowhere near as bad as Germany.
Yeah.
The context for our comrades in Germany is absolutely horrific, and the repression against any kind of expressions of solidarity with Palestine is way more aggressive in Germany than here. I mean, because Germany has its total pathologies when it comes to this, and the state, defines its very reason of existence as being a supporter of the state of Israel and the occupation. And Western Germany, which later, of course, became the United Germany, defined itself from the start as a foreign backer of the occupation. It was a key pillar of Western support for the state of Israel in the 50s and 60s. I mean, it was with German tanks that the occupation rolled into Gaza in 1967. Then the importance of Germany as a foreign backer of the Zionist entity declined a little bit after 67, when the U.S. rose to becoming by far the strongest supporter. But it's still very important. It's in Europe. It's the main supplier of military and political support for the state of Israel, and this pro-Zionist German politics encompasses virtually all of the political spectrum. The radical left in Germany has generally been terrible on Palestine, and you have the anti-Deutsche current, which is totally insane. That still has a major influence on how the German left perceives these things. So the situation in Germany is very different from here, and you don't have something like La France Insoumise in Germany that has had a consistent position of solidarity with Palestine. So Germany is the worst hell, the lowest circle of hell when it comes to these things. In the U.S., when I was there at the time of the student movement last spring, you had a freedom of expression that allowed for explicit support for the Palestinian resistance, different from what you would find here or in most of Europe. But now with Trump, you have, he promises that he's going to go after students who engaged in these kind of protests and deport them from the country. So the situation might change quite dramatically in the U.S. with the current far-right presidency. So all of this is in motion, but clearly the general trend is towards more repression of Palestine activism all over the global north.
Okay.
So it's definitely not specifically French.
Il y a aussi un enjeu très important actuellement, c'est autour du mot génocide. On voit comment c'est difficile en France de l'utiliser. Est-ce que pour vous, il y a un intérêt à lutter? Est-ce qu'on peut parler de génocide? Est-ce que pour vous, il faut lutter aussi pour imposer ce terme-là?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And just in the past few days, I've read quite a lot of articles in Journal of Genocide Research, which is the main scientific journal for the study of genocide, and there is clearly a consensus among genocide scholars, not without dissenters, but largely a consensus about this being fully a genocide. And most scholars in the field, as I understand it, would now support, for instance, the statement by Ras Segal, one of the key scholars here, who has said that this is a textbook case of genocide because it has all the components, very specific statement of intent that is being repeated daily. Just 3 days ago, we had a Likud Knesset member who said that all the adults in Gaza are guilty and they should all be killed. So he's calling for the extermination of the entire adult population in Gaza. I don't think it's going to spare the children. There's no indication that this is what the occupation tends to do. But this is now an entity that is drenched in the desire for the elimination of the Palestinian people in Gaza and elsewhere, and it's being expressed again and again and again by politicians and generals and public figures, and it's very well documented.
Yeah.
And the practice on the ground in Gaza has been very consistent. It has been a systematic destruction of all foundations for life in Gaza, a systematic targeting of the health sector and its total destruction, a systematic targeting of all forms of agriculture and other, sectors that would allow the Palestinian people to subsist, a systematic targeting of children. Children are, of course, the generation that will allow a population to reproduce itself.
Too.
Yeah, the schools, education. Yeah, so all the foundations that for life in Gaza have been, dismantled methodically, and of course, you've had mass murder of civilians. So this fulfills the criterion of the destruction of a people in whole or in part. Which is the essence of the widely accepted definition of genocide. There is no element here that is missing. And right now, we're in a moment of pause for the genocide in Gaza. What we're seeing now is that the destruction is most aggressive and intense in the refugee camps of the northern West Bank. But there are a lot of indications that in Gaza, this pause might very well come to an end soon, and that the genocide will resume. And unfortunately, there are signs that the occupation army and the US are planning for a much more intense form of genocide in the next step. So you had the Haaretz, for instance, just the other day saying that when the fighting resumes, the IDF is planning to level every single building in Gaza City and in the refugee camps of northern Gaza to the ground. Every single building. Not a single one will be allowed to remain standing. So, there's all this talk about intense fighting and, again, moving the population into various zones and intensifying the killing. We don't know if that's going to happen. There are a lot of factors moving and in flux, but I do not think that we should rest in certainty that the genocide has come to an end in Gaza. Also, the people who are there are struggling to survive because all the foundations for life have been, destroyed. So you have infants dying of cold every day because there is nothing to protect them from the weather.
Yeah. Okay. Pour revenir sur, on va revenir là sur le livre. Il y a un point que je trouve très intéressant dans votre livre, c'est que vous battez en brèche les explications qui pourraient flirter avec l'antisémitisme, et notamment cette théorie du lobby, comme quoi en fait, pour expliquer l'engagement des États-Unis principalement ou encore des pays occidentaux, ce serait parce qu'il y a un lobby sioniste, voire pour certains un lobby juif, qui pousserait les États-Unis à soutenir contre leurs intérêts Israël. Pour vous, c'est ne rien comprendre à la dynamique de l'impérialisme, c'est ça?
Yeah, I think the lobby theory is analytically and empirically flawed, as in, I think it's incorrect. But I also think, yes, that it's politically dangerous because it aligns with certain forms of, certain worldviews close to anti-Semitism. So the idea that there is a group of Jewish people that are exercising some kind of manipulative power over other countries, notably the US. This is, I think, deeply incorrect, and it's also, very bad politics. I don't think I explicitly claim in the book that the lobby theory and the people who subscribe to it are, by definition, anti-Semites or anti-Semitic, because, I think there tends to be like an overuse of, throwing this around as a slur. But I think that, yes, objectively, there is an overlap between the lobby theory and anti-Semitic worldviews that, to me, is, disconcerting.
Okay. Et aussi, dans votre livre, vous abordez une date importante, c'est 1840. Vous revenez beaucoup sur ça et vous dites que c'est un tournant autant pour le climat, pour la planète que pour le Moyen-Orient. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous expliquer en quelques lignes, parce que c'est aussi le sujet du livre, pourquoi pour vous c'est important de revenir sur cette date?
Well, I don't know if it's that important. I mean, it's not like I think that if only people were to discover what happened in 1840, everything would be fine in Palestine. That's obviously not what I would suggest. But I'm a historian by training, and my most of the research that I've done, or at least that I want to do, is in the field of history, environmental history. One question that historians like to ask themselves is, when did something begin? And there is sometimes a temptation to be too obsessed with the moment of origins, the moment when something started. But I'm kind of tempted to look for this, this goes back to a book I wrote, which came out of my PhD dissertation, called Fossil Capital, which is about the origins of our dependence on fossil fuels. And this book focused on the rise of steam power, because steam power was the first technology that really transformed our economies and made them dependent on fossil fuel, namely coal. And that book dealt with the shift to steam power within the British industry, but another important shift was the turn to steamboats rather than sailing ships, not the least in warfare. So the British Empire started using steamboats in its quest for world domination. And the first war where the British Empire used steamboats, first major battlefield where this happened, was in Palestine. It was in this war in 1840 where the British Empire destroyed the Arab proto-empire of Muhammad Ali, which at that point in time controlled Palestine, and the major battle happened at the Palestinian town of Akka. That was pulverized by steamboats in this big battle in 1840 and caused a massacre of the civilian population and the complete destruction of the town. And it also, coincidentally or not, was the moment in time when the idea of establishing a colony in Palestine and populated with Jews took hold within the upper echelons of the British Empire. So this was the first time that the people who formulated the imperialist policies of Britain came up with this idea that we could move the Jews from Europe into Palestine and have them build us a colony that will be forever attached to us. And this will be a great way for us to project our power into the region to make sure that there will be no more Muhammad Ali or other insubordinate upstarts that threaten our control over the region, and it's going to guarantee us access to the resources and to the commerce of the Levant and the Middle East more broadly.
Yeah. Ouais, juste pour rebondir sur ça, c'est que vous montrez que il apparaît dans l'Empire britannique un esprit sioniste, l'idée de colonisation, mais on le voit encore aujourd'hui, c'était pas du tout par amour des Juifs, pour protéger les intérêts des Juifs, pour sympathie à l'égard des Juifs, mais simplement pour des intérêts impérialistes. Et on voit comment des gens antisémites peuvent aussi soutenir le sionisme.
Yes, this was the main animating interest to reinforce the power of the British Empire. Then on the relation to actual living Jews by the people who came up with this idea, I think these attitudes shifted. You had Christian Zionists who had, they placed the Jews within their theological, eschatological schema, where the congregation of Jews in Palestine will herald the second coming of Jesus, and then these Jews will, at the end of the day, all convert to Christianity, and so they will cease to be Jews once they've been gathered in Palestine. There's a kind of an anti-Semitic aspect to that, because the whole point of the exercise would be to get the Jews to Palestine so they cease being Jews and become Christians instead. But I mean, maybe some of these individuals also cared for Jews at some level. It's difficult to tell, but it wasn't originally at this moment in time in any way a Jewish project. And it was very difficult to get Jews on board with it, because Jews in Britain and in other countries in Europe at this moment in time struggled for their own rights to be present in these countries and to live as anyone else in these countries. And all of a sudden you had these British imperialists who said it would be better if you just left and ended up in Palestine. And the original response to this was, no, we are here because we live here and we have the same right as anyone else to be here. And this, of course, was the original majority position within Jewish communities in Europe, which was an anti-Zionist one, and it was only later with the Holocaust and primarily the Holocaust, but before that, the various moments of escalating persecution against Jews, that you had a turn of parts of the Jewish communities in Europe towards Zionism. Yeah, but originally, it was an imperialist project exclusively.
Yeah. Mais d'ailleurs, ça me fait rebondir, je ne sais pas si vous êtes au courant, je ne sais pas aussi si tu l'as vu Ernest, il y a un journaliste français qui a dit que vous aviez développé l'idée de judéocène, que en gros, ça serait encore la cause des Juifs, qui aurait une catastrophe climatique, parce que c'est à partir d'eux qu'il y aurait une révolution industrielle sur ça. Donc qu'est-ce que vous avez à répondre à des gens qui comprennent aussi mal vos propos et qui disent que en fait, vous avez une lecture antisémite et que pour vous, c'est presque aussi à cause des Juifs qu'il y a une catastrophe climatique?
Well, this is obviously a fantastically fanciful reading of what I've written. I don't even know where to begin to unpack this. I mean, you could just as well say that I think that it's a monster on Mars that has created the climate catastrophe. It has no relation to anything I wrote. The whole argument in this particular book is that the destruction of Palestine is integrally linked to a much wider process of destruction, the destruction of the climate and other kinds of environmental destruction, and these processes of destruction stem from the way that the capitalist mode of production works. It has nothing to do with Jews or any other groups identified by any kind of ethnic or religious trait. These are deep structural processes that at the root of it, originate in the way that capital works. This is the essence of everything I've written. So obviously this is just silly propaganda from Zionists that I'm not exactly the first person to be misrepresented in this fashion. It's just constant, ongoing, demonizing and smearing, and it has no relation to any actual content of what we are saying. We in the Palestine Solidarity Movement. Bullshit.
Aussi, ce que je trouve intéressant sur la date de 1840 et l'insistance aussi sur la machine à vapeur, c'est que vous montrez que, contrairement à ce qu'on pense, l'évolution technologique, elle n'est pas tendue à l'idée de on va essayer d'améliorer la vie des gens, mais plus sur toujours de prendre le dessus sur l'ennemi militairement. Est-ce que ça me permet d'avoir cette question, est-ce que les gens n'ont pas tendance à minorer l'impact de l'industrie militaire dans la destruction de la planète? J'ai l'impression qu'on passe un petit peu à côté de ça. On va parler des voitures, on va parler de la consommation de viande, mais pas assez sur l'industrie militaire, qui est une industrie qui est consacrée à la destruction des vies humaines. Est-ce qu'il ne faut pas mettre l'accent davantage sur ça quand on voit l'actualité où tous les pays sont en train d'augmenter leur budget militaire?
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm not sure that the organized climate movement in the global north, or what remains of it, because there's very little left of it, is really that focused on private consumption. I think the focus has been, rightly so, for quite some time on investment in fossil fuels. And I think that since the genocide started, in particular, there has been much more attention drawn to the intersection between climate destruction and military colonial aggression. So just one example would be the mass action that happened yesterday in Copenhagen, where climate and Palestine activists together took over for some time the headquarters of Maersk, the shipping giant that is based in Denmark, and protested its continuous supplies of weapons, or shipping weapons and other material to to Israel and linked this with climate and the consumption of fossil fuels by this company and things like this. And Greta Thunberg was there and got badly beaten up, as did many others. So there is definitely, like I said, in what remains of the climate movement, a rising awareness of these things. And I think generally a quite good analysis of what is the real driver and what is the enemy. It's not, Greta Thunberg and her comrades don't really talk about private consumption that much, even though they try to live up to certain standards. But yeah, it's not in focus.
Dans le livre, vous n'hésitez pas à citer Hassan Nasrallah, ancien dirigeant du Hezbollah, qui est décédé il y a quelques mois suite à des bombardements israéliens. Et vous montrez que des gens qu'on présente comme fondamentalement antisémites et sans capacité de réflexion ont en fait une vision bien plus aiguisée et réfléchie sur Israël. Et notamment, ils montrent les intérêts des États-Unis à soutenir Israël. Ils ne sont pas dans l'idée d'un lobby sioniste, mais plus que Israël a des intérêts là-bas. Est-ce que vous ne pensez pas qu'à gauche, justement, on a, à cause d'une vision peut-être islamophobe, on a trop tendance, trop un réflexe à juste les résumer à des barbares sans réflexion et juste des antisémites et qu'on devrait plus se pencher sur leurs travaux?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, this is not only a problem in the left, but it is a problem in the left, in the global north, that there isn't any sustained engagement with what the Palestinian resistance and other groups in the Middle East, but I would focus on the Palestinian resistance, says and does, and the intellectual production of the resistance, everything from communiques and speeches to longer texts that have been put out by the various components of the resistance for years, for decades. So Palestinian political thinking isn't something that we engage with anywhere near what we should. And Palestinians are generally not perceived as legitimate agents in their own struggle for emancipation, and they're not perceived as people who think actively and creatively about the world around them and write about it. But they do, of course. They do it in prisons. They do it in Gaza itself. Of course, there is a level of engagement with some Palestinian intellectuals that have risen to prominence, and with social media, you have Palestinians, including inside Gaza, who speak to the world, and parts of the world will listen. But the theory and practice of the Palestinian resistance is generally ignored as something legitimate to engage with.
Vous encouragez les marxistes à faire plus l'analyse concrète de la situation dans laquelle sont les Palestiniens, à voir les contradictions et la situation concrète en Palestine. Moi, j'ai une question, c'est que j'ai l'impression que la gauche radicale anti-impérialiste était beaucoup plus cohérente durant les années 60-70, notamment avec les luttes d'indépendance. Vous prenez par exemple l'exemple du FLN, qui a aussi malheureusement tué des innocents, sans pour autant que les radicaux se disent qu'il faut plus soutenir la lutte algérienne. Comment vous expliquez que maintenant la gauche soit beaucoup plus prudente, timorée et hésite à aller dans un soutien?
I think there are many explanations for this. One is the general weakness of the left. I mean, the left has been beaten back on every front and isn't courageous or bold or audacious or filled with initiative as it was in the 60s and 70s. It's constantly on the defense.
Yeah.
Discursively and politically and things like this. Then I also think that the left generally has forgotten about or abandoned the idea of armed struggle as a kind of strategy that can be legitimate in different contexts. And the notion of solidarity with people in the global south is incomparably weaker today than it was in the 1970s and 60s. For a lot of different reasons. But and then also, of course, when it comes to the particular situation in Palestine, there is a fear of being considered, Islamo-gauchist or something like this, that you're too close to Islam, and I think maybe that's a particular factor here in France. But with from the start of the war on terror in 2001 and the general escalation of anti-Muslim politics in Europe and the rest of the global north, much of the left has caved into this or compromised with it, rather than sticking to principled positions of solidarity, with some very notable exceptions. But this kind of retreat has been quite general, I think.
J'aimerais bien aussi qu'on parle du 7 octobre. On sait combien c'est difficile d'aborder cet événement, d'avoir un discours dépassionné, tant il est présenté comme le summum de l'horreur, alors que dans le même temps, dans les médias, il y a des gens qui peuvent carrément défendre les horreurs des crimes israéliens. Mais en fait, vous dites que pour vous, s'il a suscité autant de chocs et une réponse aussi violente de la part d'Israël, c'est pas seulement en raison de la violence, mais c'est parce que pour la première fois, il y a un État qui, avec des moyens très très faibles, a apporté un coup important à un État qui est technologiquement supérieur. Est-ce que c'est ça? Est-ce que pour vous, il fallait à tout prix sanctionner très sévèrement pour empêcher que pour que les peuples du Sud retiennent la leçon et empêcher que ça recommence?
For the South in general and for the Middle East in particular, this was a moment when all of a sudden the balance of forces was overturned, and suddenly, instantly, the military supremacy of the occupation was negated completely in southern Palestine. And this was a total shock to the occupation and to its primary backer, the United States. And that shock had to be, in turn, absolutely negated with a much bigger counter shock against the Palestinian people that would also send the signal to everyone in the region that if you dare to subvert our power like the Palestinians did on October 7, we're going to destroy you utterly. And this signal was perhaps most clearly communicated to Lebanon, and it was then, in fact, also practiced in Lebanon with the war against Hezbollah and the Lebanese people, the part of the Lebanese people that support Hezbollah, that then, was a kind of a side theater to this genocidal war. It's a signal that's been communicated and practiced towards the Houthis. And of course, it's broadcast globally, just as the repression against the Palestinian solidarity activists has that kind of function, that it's intended structurally, functionally, to deter people from daring to rise up. And I'm sure that this signal reverberates across the globe, but it's more particularly something that's being broadcast within the Middle East. But that's also because the Middle East is such a politically fluid and dynamic and contradictory arena, where you have a lot of political projects that clash with the interests of the U.S. empire. I mean, what's going on in Syria right now is very interesting in this respect, because what happened in Syria with the fall of Assad was very contradictory. But right now, and since the fall of Assad, the state of Israel really again fulfilled its designated role, which is to stamp down any prospect of real Arab autonomy in the region. So what Israel did after the fall of Assad was to go in and bomb and systematically destroy the military capabilities of the Syrian state to make sure that this new Syrian regime, which has a far more authentically representative character until this day, of the interests of the Syrian people, that this state cannot possibly exercise any kind of real independence because it's not going to have any military capabilities. And this is the classical script of the entity in the region to hold down other powers and make sure that they don't become autonomous of empire. This is the logic of 1840 realized again. And just the other day, the the head of the entity, Netanyahu, has said that the Syrian army is not going to be deployed in the southern provinces of Syria. So he's not going to allow it to exist south of Damascus. So again, this entity, abrogates the right to undermine the sovereignty of other countries. Yeah. So the state of Israel says that we are the ones that decide where the soldiers of the Syrian Republic will be positioned. And we're going to stay in the areas that we occupy in southern Syria. And what you have now in southern Syria is a situation brewing where you have a popular resistance against the Israeli occupation of not only the Golan Heights, but of the parts of Syrian territory that they have seized since the fall of Assad. So you have people in Dara and Koneitra and other parts of southern Syria demonstrating now against the Israeli army. And it's interesting because for the first time here you have people who toppled Assad and who have been engaged in this revolutionary project for many years coming to a collision with the Israeli occupation of that country. So, this is just one example of how Israeli destruction of its neighbors is meant to keep people in place and have them subjugated. But generally, this is a project fraught with instabilities because people in this region don't like to be occupied and oppressed and, subject to genocide. So there is resistance happening again and again, and this is why this region keeps producing these conflagrations over and over again, in a way that other parts of the world don't do to the same extent.
J'aimerais faire un parallèle ici avec la question climatique. Comment penser le rapport à la violence et comment on peut jauger d'une décision, d'une action violente. Donc déjà, est-ce qu'on n'est pas trop gentil? Et comment on fait pour jauger si on doit, accélérer d'un cran en question du point de vue climatique?
Yeah, so concrete analysis of the concrete situation would have to be the methodological principle here, which means that obviously if we're talking about the relation between the climate fronts and the Palestinian front, we can't reasonably advocate some kind of emulation or copying of the Palestinian resistance, because the struggle against fossil capital in countries in the global north, perhaps in particular, is a struggle that is very different from the struggle against the settler colonial occupation. I don't think anyone could argue that we should copy Qassam and do what they're doing here in the struggle against fossil fuel companies or something like that. So the level of militancy that you decide on in a movement has to be finely calibrated to where you are, what situation you operate in, what you can achieve, what you want to accomplish. And I think that it would be disastrous for the climate movement. This I made very clear in my book on sabotage, to, for instance, start to physically attacking individuals. People have speculated about assassinating fossil fuel executives and things like that. I think that would be a bad idea. I think it would have very detrimental effects. Okay. Apart from every murder is prima facie originally it's morally bad. So if you're going to do it, you will have to have very strong justifications for it. And these justifications would be lacking, particularly if in a situation like this you cause harm to your own movement, your own cause, which I think would be the case. But I do think, yes, that the climate movement and the climate struggle generally is too gentle, too nervous, too modest, too civil. Not militant enough. The big exception, of course, is the sort of monde de la terre and the struggle here in France that has taken environmental struggles to a totally new level of militancy that you haven't seen anywhere else in the global north. But if you look, for instance, at what happened in Valencia last year, there was this terrible disaster, floods in late October that killed more than 200 people. And after that, about 10 days later, you had a mass demonstration in Valencia with more than 100,000 people on the streets, and you had riots, probably the first climate-induced riots in the global north, in the sense that you had an extreme weather event clearly caused by fossil fuel combustion that precipitated confrontations in the streets. But these demonstrations and these riots, they targeted the right-wing government of Valencia for not helping people, which of course is legitimate, but what was not targeted was Repsol, which is the Spanish incarnation of fossil capital, one of the oil and gas giants of this world that keeps pouring fuel on this fire. So Repsol is continuously investing in oil and gas, much more so than renewables, because it's more profitable for all of these companies it is. And just a few months before this disaster in Valencia, there was a deal sealed for Repsol to expand its operations in Venezuela and pump more oil and gas and things like that. This company wasn't targeted by anyone in conjunction with what happened in Valencia. The dots were not connected by the enraged crowds, the masses in Valencia, or it seems anyone else on the political spectrum of Spain. And that really is the strategic challenge for the climate struggle to in these moments of rage, and we'll see more of them when new extreme weather events hit, people need to direct the anger, at least some of it, against the drivers of this problem and not the symptoms. And the deep drivers of this problem, of course, are the fossil fuel companies that keep pouring fuel in the fire. And they are the ones that need to be targeted at some point. And it needs to happen with a greater degree of militancy than what we've seen so far, which is not to say that we're going to be Sarai al-Quds, but we will need to step up.
Ok. Et il y a aussi un autre point intéressant dans votre développement, dans le parallèle entre la Palestine et la destruction de la planète, c'est que dans les deux cas, on a une multitude d'informations sur le degré de destruction. On a plein de renseignements et il y a même des ONG qui alertent. Par exemple, pour la Palestine, il va y avoir Amnesty International. Pour la planète, il va y avoir le GIEC. Donc, on sait qu'il y a une destruction. On sait qu'il y a des choses horribles qui se passent. Et dans les deux cas, il y a très peu d'actions pour régler cette situation, voire même certains nient la réalité de cette destruction. Est-ce qu'on n'est pas là face à une limite du point de vue de l'action militante, de croire qu'il suffit de démontrer les faits pour que les gens soient convaincus et donc, est-ce que vous avez une idée de ce qu'il faudrait faire?
Yeah, it's a limit to idealist activism. The idea that the point with activism is to spread knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And this was quite common in the climate movement back in 2018-19, when Greta Thunberg, for instance, had the phrase "listen to the science" as one of her key, demands when communicating with politicians. She would ask them to just open their eyes and listen to the science. But she has given up on this and understood, as far as I can see, that the struggle of the climate is not primarily a struggle over knowledge or science. It's a struggle around deep material interests. So the point is not to open the eyes of politicians to the science, because the knowledge is there in abundance. The point is to exercise some kind of counterpower that would force the change that we need to see. And of course, it's the same with Palestine. We have an overabundance of documentation of Israeli atrocities from 1948 onwards, earlier too. But that doesn't change anything unless you have a change in the balance of forces. This is what politics is really about. We as revolutionaries, we can know everything about the world, but that doesn't change anything if we don't have some kind of power with which to oppose the power of the dominant class.
Yeah. Et d'ailleurs, aussi pour un dernier parallèle entre Palestine et le climat, est-ce que pour vous, on devrait aussi, comme on parle de crimes contre l'humanité perpétrés par Israël contre les Palestiniens, on devrait utiliser les mêmes termes par rapport à l'inaction climatique, parler de crimes contre l'humanité face à l'inaction des dirigeants occidentaux?
Well, genocide is a particular category that I wouldn't really apply to the destruction of climate as such.
Okay.
There is a mention, I think in this book, but it's also something that Wim and I write about in a book called Overshoot that hasn't appeared in French yet, where we toy with the concept of paupericide, so the killing of poor people. The difference would then be that in genocide, you have the intentional targeting of a particular group that you want to destroy. So, for instance, when this Knesset member says that all the adult people in Gaza should be killed, then he is explicitly saying that he wants to see the destruction of this group of people because of what group of people they are.
Yeah.
You don't really see that on the climate front. So, for instance, when you have now, we've recently had the worst drought in recorded history in southern Africa, with a lot of farmers in Mozambique, for instance, starving because of harvests disappearing, withering. This is an effect of fossil fuel combustion, but it's not like the investors of Exxon, the people who invest in ExxonMobil want to kill the farmers of Mozambique because of who they are, which is the logic of genocide, as understood at least a little bit narrowly. So the term that we just, throw out here, paupericide, would be that rather the mass killing of poor people in the global south is an accepted byproduct of investing in fossil fuels. There is full knowledge of these consequences, but the people who invest in fossil fuel production couldn't care less about the death of these poor people in the global south. There's a sliding scale. There are fine gradations about what crime is committed here, but it seems to be something different from what the occupation is doing in Gaza. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not a scholar of genocide and of international law, but analytically, it seems to me that there's something slightly different. Then, of course, there are a lot of discussions, including in legal scholarship, about ecocide and what kind of crimes fossil fuel companies and investors can and should be prosecuted for. And we're sure going to see a lot more of that when this crime, is compounded and everything gets worse and more people die.
J'aurais deux dernières questions, une question bonus. Alors, c'est une question un peu plus globale. Qu'est-ce que vous avez à répondre à ceux qui vous reprochent une ligne trop léniniste, trop autoritaire, trop étatique, une ligne trop par le haut sur la question de l'écologie?
Well, this is a misunderstanding. There's no passion for the bourgeois state. Definitely not. It's the exact opposite. I mean, Leninism isn't passionate about the state. It's deeply hostile to the bourgeois state. But the Leninist insight into politics, one of many, is that if you want to destroy a very powerful enemy, then you would need to use something like the state. This is not against politics from below, to the contrary. And to make this a little bit more concrete, there is today in the world one example of a country that is trying to terminate its own fossil fuel industry and phase out the production of oil and gas and coal from its economy. And this is the country of Colombia, which has a left-wing government. People like Petro, who, of course, has a Leninist background. These people are not in power despite politics from below, but thanks to politics from below. More concretely, the popular revolt that happened in Colombia in 2019 in particular, that was a groundswell of popular protest with everything from riots and blockades and strikes and everything like that. And out of this came the electoral project of Petro, and he won the presidential elections in 2020. And in his campaign, he promised to wind down the fossil fuel industry in his country, and he has fulfilled his promise. So there hasn't been a single license given to oil exploration in Colombia since he came into power, and oil output in Colombia is going down. And if his policy remains in place, the oil industry will go out of business in Colombia during the 2030s, maybe even as early as 2031. If you stop exploring for oil, if you stop drilling, you don't find replacements for the reserves that are depleted. So naturally, the business comes to an end if you don't renew the supplies. And this is unique in the world. We don't have any other major fossil fuel producer, and this is the third largest producer of oil and gas in Latin America.
Yeah.
That has this kind of policy, but this is exactly what we need. And there's total scientific consensus about this. If we're going to have any chance of maintaining this planet in a habitable state, fossil fuels have to be left in the ground. So this means that you need an agent that can impose this on private investors. And the only agent that seems capable of doing this is the state. Now, and if it's not the state, if it's like, let's say it's sort of monde de la Terre that takes over France and establishes this kind of power, then it's a de facto state. It's the center of a coercive power that can enforce something like a shutdown of the fossil fuel industry. Now, I think it would be great if Monde de la Terre or some other movement of this kind could constitute a new state apparatus in France, but maybe a more likely scenario is that you would have new cycles of popular protest in a country like France, and you would have an electoral victory for a left force, which would, I mean, obviously, if in the current situation, that would mean La France Insoumise. Something similar to what you've seen in Colombia. And actually, France is the only country in Europe where you can discern a dynamic of this kind, because it's the only country that in recent years has had a kind of productive dialectic between social movements outside of parliament and a left that is represented in parliament and that has at least a chance at electoral success.
Indeed.
Yeah. So, anarchists who don't like this idea, I'm happy to discuss with them, but I don't see their alternative as logically coherent or credible, because if they were to constitute themselves as a real power that could take down an enemy, they would be a de facto state, just as the anarchists in the Spanish Civil War became a de facto state apparatus when they even entered the government when they were fighting the fascists. Anarchists wielding power become Leninists.
J'aurais une dernière question de conclusion. Voilà, pour conclure la discussion. Pour vous, qu'est-ce que l'ensemble des organisations de gauche, de la gauche radicale, et en particulier de l'écologie, ont à apprendre de la lutte des Palestiniens?
Well, first of all, to never give up.
Yeah.
This is what the Palestinian resistance says and does every day. We're not going to give up.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how much you kill us, how much you destroy us. We are here. We're staying. This is our land. We belong to this land. We're going to continue fighting. Surrender is not an option. It doesn't exist within our DNA to contemplate surrender. This is what the Palestinian resistance is saying all the time. And by saying this and by doing this, it is doing a service to all of humanity, because it is showing all of us that no matter how dark the situation is, and no matter how overwhelmingly powerful the enemy is, and no matter how destructive it is in the way that it treats people and nature, we are still going to resist. No matter the losses that we've suffered, and no matter the fact that our country was destroyed in 1948 and it's continuously destroyed on a daily basis, we're going to keep up and we're going to stand up, and one day, inshallah, the balance of forces will change and we're going to return.
Rien à voir, c'est une curiosité. Il y a beaucoup de gens qui me demandaient, est-ce qu'il y a une raison pour ce chapeau?
It hides my baldness. It makes me look vaguely Islamic, which I don't mind, because if some people find this, Islamo-gauchist, I'm fine with it.
Okay.
I'm not a practicing Muslim. It's more like It's more like cultural.
I'm disappointed.
Yeah, I understand. It's more like cultural appropriation, I guess.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, okay. It's from Cairo.
Yeah. Okay. Eh bien, écoutez, merci beaucoup pour cette réponse. Merci Ernest, t'as été incroyable, hein, trop fort. Merci à tous. Merci. Est-ce qu'un dernier mot? Il a peut-être un dernier truc à ajouter?
No, no, no.
Non, it's okay. Eh bien, écoutez, merci à tous. Je rappelle le livre Pour la Palestine comme pour la Terre, les ravages de l'impérialisme fossile, aux éditions La Fabrique. Allez le lire, il est très court, il est vraiment passionnant. Et allez lire aussi les autres livres de Andreas Malm qui sont tous édités à La Fabrique, il me semble, en langue française. Voilà, merci encore Andreas, c'était un vrai plaisir.
Thank you.
Et à bientôt. Et Palestine vivra, Palestine vaincra.